Kim is desperate for technology to improve the launching of satellites, as he would describe it. But of course, that same technology can be used on long-range ballistic missiles, which he would dearly like to develop to carry nuclear warheads. So there's a lot at stake. That he wants Russian technology, he wants more advanced Russian weapons, he wants the international recognition that a visit by Putin would supply. But, you know, Putin's running risks, because here he is writing an article for a North Korean newspaper, which sounds like a big deal, but there aren't many North Korean newspapers, effectively identifying his struggle against the West with that of North Korea. You know, and that is a bit of a risk, because you're associating yourself with, you know, there are a few despots who are bigger than the North Koreans, and to associate so closely with them runs other sorts of risks as well.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the significance of Vladimir Putin's trip to Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, and also Russia's other global alliances. And I'm delighted to be joined by Ian Williams, an award-winning journalist and China expert. He's the author of books including The Fire of the Dragon, China's New Cold War, and Every Breath You Take, China's New Tyranny. Ian's also been a foreign correspondent for NBC News and Channel 4 News, and previously worked for the Sunday Times, and over the years he's covered conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East and Ukraine. Ian, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Frontline.
A pleasure to be here.
Why do you think Vladimir Putin has chosen this moment to visit North Korea?
I think there's an element of desperation in it. He's come to depend upon North Korea for the supply of weapons, for artillery shells, for ballistic missiles, some 11,000 containers worth of weapons, according to the Americans. He's in desperate need of these armaments. North Korea is perhaps the only country in the world in a position to be able to supply them, because it has such an enormous stockpile of its own, not all of it in the best of shape. And it's also a pariah state. It's a state which has been shunned by the world for decades. It's a state which starved to death millions of its own people and is possibly the most repressive place on the planet. So it's in dire need of the attention, and Putin is desperate enough to supply that attention.
And Kim Jong-un did visit Vladivostok last September, but this is the first time Putin has gone to North Korea itself since 2000. So the fact that it's Putin going to Kim, does that speak to Putin's desperation?
It does. I mean, we're seeing a big reception for him, the flags, the pictures on the streets. I mean, the North Koreans are making a big thing of it. When Kim Jong-un went to the Far East, to the Russian Far East last year, Putin took him to a space facility because Kim is desperate for technology to improve the launching of satellites, as he would describe it. But of course, that same technology can be used on long-range ballistic missiles, which he would dearly like to develop to carry nuclear warheads. So there's a lot at stake. That he wants Russian technology, he wants more advanced Russian weapons, he wants the international recognition that a visit by Putin would supply. But, you know, Putin's running risks, because here he is writing an article for a North Korean newspaper, which sounds like a big deal, but there aren't many North Korean newspapers, effectively identifying his struggle against the West with that of North Korea. You know, and that is a bit of a risk, because you're associating yourself with, you know, there are a few despots who are bigger than the North Koreans, and to associate so closely with them runs other sorts of risks as well.
Talking of the weapons that North Korea has been supplying Russia, how are they being used on the front line in Ukraine?
It's mainly artillery shells, because a lot of the technology which the North Koreans have is not terribly advanced, but there's a lot of it. And there's a big shortage of artillery shells on the battlefield in Ukraine. There's been some doubt about how effective, because they've been in storage, they've not been looked after as well as perhaps other countries would. North Korea has a lot of stuff, but it's not always the first generation stuff. Of course, this gives them the ability to test a lot of that in a battle situation. The Russians are in desperate need of artillery shells as indeed are the Ukrainians. And here's North Korea being one of the few places on the planet with a sufficient surplus to keep the Russian guns ticking over. And of course, we seem to be also, if according to American briefings, short-range ballistic missiles have also been supplied. And this has been confirmed by information that has come from the battlefield, from Ukrainians who've identified the North Korean markings on these munitions.
How effective are the munitions as well that North Korea provides?
That is debatable. We have seen Ukrainian sources say they're not very accurate. A lot of them don't go off. The fuses are duff. It's not the most effective weaponry, but I don't think the Russians particularly care.
They'll take it.
They'll take it. They need it. And accuracy is perhaps not something that they've been particularly bothered with. The purpose of a lot of these bombardments is to create terror. It's to lob these into cities. They're not really into pinpoint accuracy. The purpose is different. And they're so, if you're getting these shells in the quantity that the North Koreans appear to be supplying, then okay, a proportion of them don't work. A proportion of them go awry. But in the bigger scheme of things, that doesn't really matter to the Russian war machine, which has never really been into pinpoint accuracy and has never really been about avoiding civilian casualties.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, Russia throughout seems to have been pursuing the strategy of just throwing everything it can at the front line, including men. You look at the casualty rate, it's enormously high, but doesn't particularly seem to deter Vladimir Putin. He'll pursue the meat grinder strategy if necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few other places on the planet, or a few other countries on the planet, which would accept the extent of the attrition that we've seen in the Russian army. And I think this very much fits in with the Russian approach to warfare. The accuracy of these things at the end of the day doesn't really matter. It's the quantity of them. It's the fact it can fire them. The fact that people get hurt, the fact that they are not very accurate is neither here nor there.
Obviously, Russia and North Korea are both part of this sort of alliance of authoritarian states in China, Russia, Iran and North Korea. How significant is that alliance and what are the dynamics inside it?
It's fascinating because if you think back, it's not been that long that we've been talking about an alliance of autocrats. And when the term was first used, there was a lot of pushback. It was, well, no, they're not really. It's not like NATO, say, for instance, where you've got a defensive alliance held together by shared democratic values, which arguably is more solid. When you've got a bunch of autocrats trying to work together out of self-interest, it's not as stable as a defensive alliance built upon shared values, in my opinion. But what you do have is a marriage of convenience. What you do have is particularly with Iran, North Korea, China and Russia, is a series of states in whose interest it is to work together at the moment because of their anti-Western sentiment, because of their view of the world, because of their immediate self-interest. So it may be a marriage of convenience, but that makes it no less dangerous for it.
And of course, Russia, Iran, North Korea, all very consequential, but fundamentally, China is the dominant player. It was interesting, I was speaking yesterday on Frontline to the journalist Michael Bosyerkiv, and he was saying that in his view, Xi Jinping could end the war in Ukraine with one phone call to Vladimir Putin. Do you think he has that influence?
Yes, without a doubt. I don't think that the war in Ukraine would be sustainable without Chinese support. China is effectively underwriting the war through its massively increased trade with Russia, whether that's buying Russian oil, gas, supplying machine tools, chips, drones, dual-use items, items which can help rebuild and sustain Russia's military-industrial base. But China has the upper hand. Only a week or two ago, discussions over a new gas pipeline, which would bring Russian gas from its European fields to China, stalled over price because the Chinese wanted it at a very cheap price, which the Russians weren't prepared to move to yet. They may well do, because they really have no choice, because that gas can't go to Europe anymore. So China is very much the dominant partner and the dominant element of this alliance of autocrats. And there's no doubt, in my view, that the war in Ukraine could not be sustainable by Russia without the support it's getting, direct and indirect, from China.
And is it your view, Ian, that it is in China's interest at the moment to keep the war in Ukraine going because it destabilises the West politically, whether they want to move on Taiwan, and that's a separate issue, I suppose, but also it undermines the West economically as well?
Both. Also, I think there's an element of a shared worldview between Xi and Putin. Both of them harbour a resentment, a sense of victimization, historic. They both believe in the restoration of national greatness. We've seen Putin and his Ruski Mir rebuilding the Russian world. Xi has his China dream of rejuvenating the Chinese China, the Qing dynasty, effectively. And both of these are built upon a deep resentment to the West, against the West, a belief that the West is decaying and in decline. So there is quite a fundamental shared belief between the two. But over and above that, I think China sees it as it's in its economic interests in the short term to support Russia, and in its strategic interests because it emerges as by far the dominant partner in that relationship. It also draws Western attention away from the Asia-Pacific and away from what China may or may not do around Taiwan. It also gives China a front row seat to look at the way the war is played out. It's learning lessons from that war. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, bases a lot of its own tactics and strategy on those of the Russian army. So it's almost looking at the Russian missteps in Ukraine and learning from those for its own planning as regards what it will do in and around Taiwan. So for all those reasons, it suits China at the moment. But there are consequences for that, one of which is it is rapidly losing Western Europe. One of China's roles has been to try and split off Europe from America. But one of the elements which is pushing Europe closer to America is its revulsion over Chinese support for Russia.
Well, that's a really good point, and I suppose it begs the question, if we are agreed that Xi Jinping does have the power to pick up the phone and end the war with one call to Putin, what would it take for him actually to make that call?
Well, I think it would be, I have long felt that the Chinese economy is an accident waiting to happen. I think for multiple reasons, we may have seen peak China. I think ranging from the property crisis through to massive youth unemployment, an economic model that simply doesn't work anymore in China, just throwing massive investment at infrastructure that you don't use, or whether it's property. I think there are real economic problems that China is facing. And I think that if there was to be a rethink on the part of Xi, it would be because of the economic situation it's facing, and because China would recognize that particularly Europe, for instance, it is losing Europe because of China's support for Russia. It's the one thing, I think, Europe has always been fairly divided over its attitude towards China, but one thing that unifies it, with the exception of perhaps Hungary, but for the most part, there is widespread revulsion and anger at what is seen as quite open Chinese support for Russian aggression.
Hello, it's James here. We'll be right back with today's episode of Frontline in just a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you about a really exciting new YouTube channel. And if you like Frontline, I think you're going to love this. It's called History Undone, with me, James Hansen. And every week we look at a different battle and ask, what if? In other words, asking what the long-term historical consequences might have been had certain key factors panned out differently. Our first episode was all about D-Day. Our latest episode is about the Battle of Arras in 1940. A lesser-known battle, but with huge strategic implications. Had it panned out differently, potentially the British evacuation of Dunkirk may not have happened. Would Churchill have sued for peace? Would the Americans have entered the war? What would have happened to the Soviet Union? Would Stalin have ended up in a prison camp in Berlin? These are the questions we ask every week on History Undone. We'll put a link to the channel in the description of this video. Please do like, share and subscribe and watch History Undone. And China officially would say it's neutral when it comes to the war in Ukraine, but do you think that's just completely disingenuous?
It's completely. I mean, I don't think that that bears any scrutiny. Not only do you have the very obvious support for Russia and the underwriting of the aggression, but Russia is parroting the same justifications for the war. It's repeating the same lines that we've seen out of Moscow. There have been leaked documents that have come from Chinese news, from Russian news sources, that suggest there's actually a formal arrangement between the Chinese media and the Russian media to echo each other's disinformation. And foremost among that, of course, is stuff that comes out about the war. So, you know, it's pretty clear that there's no nuance. There's no, you know, China bangs on about the importance of territorial integrity, the importance of sovereignty, both of which the Russians have flagrantly broken. But of course, it conveniently puts that to one side at the moment when it comes to the aggression in Ukraine. And we saw Zelensky just a few days ago openly accusing, he's been very cautious about the degree to which he accuses China of supporting Russia, because, you know, Ukraine had pretty good relations with Beijing before the war. But even he accused China, when he was at the G7, of trying to sabotage the peace conference, which was held in Switzerland. Well,
it's funny you mention that, Ian. I wanted to touch on that because, okay, there's obviously a lot of publicity around this so-called CRINC alliance of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. But actually, maybe what's more significant is the alliance of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and of the communique that was agreed at the end of the peace summit in Switzerland. It was notable that not a single BRIC country actually signed it. Most of them abstained. Obviously, some didn't attend at all. Is that really the more important alliance?
I think it is. And I think that the Chinese, Moscow and Beijing recognize that it's more important to them to sort of sustain this sense of neutrality, whether it's in India, Brazil, the Middle Eastern countries. But you know, these countries are transactional. You know, they are looking at this conflict essentially as to what they can make out of it. You know, India's done rather well with its cheaper supplies of gas and oil that it's able to get from Russia, but they are essentially transactional. And I think coming back to the North Korean, what's happening with North Korea, even countries which talk about neutrality understand that North Korea is beyond the pale. And it's a risk that Putin's running. You know, you're trying to sustain these relationships with South Africa and India and Brazil, and making them understand that, you know, that it's in their interest just really not to get involved, and that's had quite a receptive audience in those countries. It's not our fight, you know, we're going to keep our distance from it. It suits us to maintain relations with Russia. But when they see Russia getting increasingly close to players like North Korea or Iran, who've shown themselves to be highly destructive and highly dangerous in their neighborhoods and beyond, it does run the risk of pushing some of these other states closer to support for the West and for Ukraine.
So Putin's taking a bit of a gamble here, which he's not averse to doing. But I mean, maybe it speaks to that desperation you were describing earlier, Ian, that he's prepared to take this risk of isolating potential allies or people who might be neutral towards Russia by embracing North Korea to this extent.
Yes, and I think even in that neighborhood, if you take South Korea, Japan, these are countries which have been supportive of Ukraine, and they're countries which are closer now and have been edging even more close to the United States in solidifying their alliances out of concern for what China is doing in the neighborhood. And by embracing North Korea so closely, it seems almost guaranteed to freak out a lot of people in Seoul and in Tokyo and push them closer to the Americans. So he's, you know, there are a lot of risks in what he's doing.
And to go back to the BRIC countries, I mean, for instance, Brazil and India, big economic players with, as you say, officially neutral links to Russia. There are different types of neutrality. I mean, famously during the war, Ireland was neutral, but would say probably, a lot of historians say, it's kind of neutral on the side of the Allies. So there are different types of neutrality. Could you see some of those countries that officially stay neutral, maintain some links to Russia, but start to move away?
I think so. I mean, the BRICS it's being far from unified. It's very difficult to get them to agree to anything. It was always, when China was seeking to turn the BRICS into a more overt anti-Western group, they encountered huge problems because the members of the BRICS have different perceptive. They're all self-interested. There is a very transactional view, but they also have very different views of the world. You know, the way India sees its position. I mean, it's very difficult relationship with China, for instance, which is a very close ally of Russia. South Africa, the roots of its relationship with Russia go back to the liberation struggle, but of course the ANC is now in difficulty politically. Brazil, again, there's a lot of self-interest there, but no great love. And I think it's easy to see neutrality, as the Russians or Moscow would, as being somehow affirmation of what it's doing in Ukraine. And I think that it's quite fragile. And I think behind the scenes, there are almost certainly conversations going on, and conversations which no doubt will be encouraged by what Putin is doing with the North Koreans.
We should probably mention that after his visit to North Korea, Putin's expected to travel to Vietnam, which is another long-standing ally of Russia. What are some of the other smaller countries potentially in Asia that have alliances with Russia?
Well, again, Vietnam is a complicated one because Vietnam historically was close to Russia, but Vietnam historically has had a terrible relationship with China. You know, the last major war that China fought was in 1979 when it invaded Vietnam to teach it a lesson because the Vietnamese ousted the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And the ones that were taught a lesson were the PLA because they retreated after 3 months because the Vietnamese were a far more battle-hardened army. And Vietnam's a classic example of a country which I can't imagine particularly wants to get involved because they have a long-standing difficult relationship with China. As a result of that, they've been moving far closer to the United States, including visits by US warships to bases which in Vietnam. So it's one of those classic examples where, yes, Putin will go to Vietnam, but I can't imagine that there would be, the conversations, I think, will be difficult.
What are the limits to applying diplomatic pressure on Russia? Clearly, if they're diplomatically isolated, that will have an impact. But does that only go so far? And fundamentally, does the isolation that might end the war in Ukraine, for instance, come down to economic isolation?
I think so. Again, coming back to China, I mean, China is the one that has most influence on Putin. There's no doubt about that because it's the Chinese lifeline which is keeping the war going. To a lesser extent, there are the Middle Eastern countries, India buying oil and other raw materials from Russia, but it will be economic at the end of the day. It will that I think that the decision will be based upon if we do see any movement from Russia.
And are we starting to see signs that China is losing a bit of patience with Russia?
I don't see any at the moment. I think there are signs that there are tensions in the relationship, and the gas pipeline, the Power of Siberia 2, is a prime example of the limits to the relationship, and a prime example of the fact that China will put its own interests first, and is quite keen to demonstrate that it does have the upper hand in that relationship. But I don't see at the moment that any sign of China reducing its relations with Russia, even though this has become central to the conversation every time Xi Jinping goes to Europe or goes to other Western countries. I sometimes think that he perhaps does not fully appreciate how important and how damaging that relationship has been to his hope of rebuilding economic ties or pushing back the tide of de-risking, as it's called, that's coming out of Europe.
Well, that's a good point. I think when he visited Europe, was it last month or the month before, the countries he chose to visit, okay, he visited President Macron in France, but then he visited Viktor Orban in Hungary. I may be getting this wrong, but I think he visited Robert Fico in Slovakia. Countries that have been, with the exception of France, quite sympathetic to Russia.
It was, and it was an intriguing visit because he made no attempts. I mean, I think France has always been a little bit maverick with its foreign policy, and it's always been central to Xi's diplomacy to try and separate Europe from America in their approaches to China. But yeah, I mean, apart from the visit to France, it was all to countries which we know are already well disposed towards China, and countries in which he already has significant influence because of Chinese investments.
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is very active in Hungary, is it not?
It is, but it's that's had a mixed reception, because if you look across the former East European countries, now members of the EU, there's a lot of disillusionment about the Belt and Road. There's been a lot of promises, very few of which have actually been followed through. And there's been considerable pushback, and Hungary and to a lesser extent Slovakia are perhaps the only two countries where it's still spoken about positively.
What more could the West be doing to ramp up economic pressure on Russia and to a lesser extent to China?
Well, I think that the focus is already moving towards Chinese companies which are seen as being supportive of Russia. There have been veiled threats ahead of Antony Blinken's last visit to Beijing, where he was quite explicit in his own warnings that China was sustaining this war in Ukraine. And the Americans have already targeted a swathe of Chinese companies for supplying dual-use items to Russia. And I think part of the strategy is to step up the pressure on Chinese companies and the threats to cut them off from the global financial system if they are deemed to be supporting Russia's war machine. I think it is disappointing that Russia and the Russian economy has been able to sustain itself as effectively as it has in spite of sanctions. There are efforts to try and bolster those sanctions further, but I think that the strategy, as I understand it now, is to look beyond that and to look at companies in other countries which are working to sustain Russia, and particularly Chinese companies.
But that could come with a significant economic cost to countries in Europe, and I suppose the key question is whether Europe is prepared to pay that price.
I think that's always been the question, whether Europe is fully on board, whether Europe is prepared ultimately to accept the costs of sanctions on companies, companies which are not directly involved in the conflict, but which are secondary or at the periphery of the conflict. The Americans have been much more aggressive in going after companies which are supplying dual-use items, which are operating through front companies, whether that be in Hong Kong, in China, elsewhere. Europe's always been a little bit more cautious about doing that, but I think that will be something that will change.
Just finally, and to return to where we started, Putin going to Pyongyang, does that speak to the fact that Vladimir Putin is now an international pariah in the same way that Kim Jong-un is?
Most definitely. I mean, and I think this is almost, but he said it in his own words, that here is a country, a dictator, who is the ultimate pariah, who's been treated as a despot over the last decades. And here is Putin going there and closely identifying himself and his struggle with the West with that of North Korea, with that of Pyongyang. And I think that is going to be something which could potentially backfire on him, especially among those who've perhaps bitten their lip and thinking, well, we don't really want to get involved in this. We don't really want to overtly oppose what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I think a lot of countries will be genuinely horrified at the thought of this tightening alliance between Russia and North Korea, especially if we see emerging from this some sort of beefed up statement of a more formal relationship, a more formal type of exchange of trade or technology, perhaps even military technology to North Korea.
Ian Williams, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.